Well, thanks everybody for coming here. I'd like to begin by sharing my own little story with the justice system. When I was about 20 years old, I was coming out of the law school after a long day, and I had 2 pesos in my pocket, and I took the bus, and I took the wrong bus. It was a trolebus, an electric bus in Mexico City, and I realized I was in the wrong trolebus when I stepped in, and I had already paid my fare, and I asked for the bus driver to get my money back, and he refused. There was a long line of people behind me, and I just couldn't understand why he would object. So after a little bit of arguing, I decided to snatch my little coin back, because otherwise it would mean walking like home for 2 hours. So I snatched the coin, and to my bad luck, there was a police officer coming right behind me, and he arrested me. And I was taken to a Ministerio Público, a prosecutor's office in Mexico City, and I spent 3 hours in a holding cell. And I managed to get out of there. And it was only about 10 years later that when I was invited to conduct a study in Mexico's courts, that I realized what I was, the danger I was in, because I found out that about 60% of Mexico's prison population is composed of people who stole a plastic mango or a belt or a subway ticket. Really the impoverished are the ones who end up being punished by the justice system. And that, later that led to making this film, Presunto Culpable. And what I want to show is how the justice system in Mexico is looking compared to the rest of the world first. So this is not my data. What I'm going to show you here is how every dot here represents a country. And this is data from the World Justice Project, the Rule of Law Index. So the y-axis is the effectiveness of the justice system, and the x-axis is just country wealth. So if you're at the top right, you're a rich nation with a very effective justice system, and at the bottom left, you're a poor country with a high impunity justice system or low ineffectiveness. And Mexico's right here. It's performing well below its income level, well below most African nations, well below most Latin American nations, well below most Asian nations. So the size of the challenge is huge. And the international concern about Mexico's justice system is really well deserved. It's a very high impunity justice system. So I've been thinking about how to increase the quality of police behavior in my country for a while. And Mexico is undergoing right now very significant reforms to its justice system. It's adopting an adversary system with open public trials. It's got 15 months left to implement this new criminal justice system. And many of the changes that the country is undergoing are really positive. I'm going to show you data about that. We're having open public courtrooms with better infrastructure. But the pyramid, the base of the justice system, which is the police, the defenders, that portion has not been well addressed by reformers. Just very briefly, for those who haven't seen the film and for those who haven't been in a Mexican court, this is Victor Reyes, one of the witnesses who accused Toño in the film. Toño is the protagonist of Presunto Culpable. The detective who arrested Toño here behind bars, and that detective. That's the judge and Toño's defenders. And this is how things were looking back in 2011 when the film was released theatrically. Here we see the weeks when the film was being exhibited, and on the y-axis is the viewers. And on the third week of exhibition, a judge banned the film. And this is part of the story of how it became the most seen documentary in Mexico's history. Because they banned it, and then they were victims of their own awkwardness, because they announced the ban, but they couldn't execute the ban until they notified each theater. So people ran to theaters, and the rest is history. The film got pirated. It was being sold in the subway. It was being sold in prisons. About 75% of the prison population has seen the film. And then this is my daughter Emiliana with the Emmy Award that we got. And then we got coverage by the Wall Street Journal. This is the front page of the weekend edition. And at this point, one of my advisors at the public policy school called me to his office, and he said, "You're not going to graduate from the PhD program with a film. You have to have actual data. This is, just a dot in our point of view." So I found that very compelling, and I decided to go find out really whether Toño's case was representative or was it unique. And with the help of many colleagues, among them Laida Negrete, the mother of my children, and with the World Justice Project, with the help of my advisors, I designed a survey instrument that I decided to go test out. And one of the things we did is we were trying to interview the prison population who had been convicted already. And when we think about that, everybody thinks, or most people, the reaction of most people is, well, inmates are going to be biased, or they're not going to tell you the truth, and so this is probably not worth it. So I'm going to show you one of the most important results I have. We went and asked the convicted inmates whether they were innocent of the crime for which they ended up in prison. And this is the result. So the blue bars are the old justice system, and the red bars are the new justice system convicts. And each group, this is one state, another state, another state. And I'm sorry that I don't know what happened with the fonts. But so this is Mexico State, a state that surrounds Mexico City, old and new. As you can see, you see a decline in the amount of inmates who say that they were convicted in spite of being innocent. So this is Baja California, and that's a huge change from 56% down to 37%. This is Chihuahua, the old justice system, and the new one. That's not such a dramatic change. And I'm sorry, I don't know what happened with the graph, with the slide, but in every case you see either a big decline or a small decline in the prison population that say they were convicted in error. So this is huge, very positive change, especially in these two states. And it kind of suggests that this is going to play well for Mexico. This is the kind of reform that is going to result in having a justice system that is more accurate, more credible. But then the other side of the story is that it's not big enough as a change, because if we just look at the best case, which are the two best cases, Baja California and Estado de Mexico, and if we believe what the inmates are telling us, then the system is still making a mistake about 40% of the time. We're still convicting innocents in a very high rate. So there must be room for improvement, and there's something missing in these reforms. Again, some positive news. When were you considered guilty? Were you considered guilty before the trial, or guilty after the trial took place and after the judge heard the evidence? And this all the states together. And so in the old justice system, 68% people thought they were guilty before the trial, and that number goes down. So that is speaks positively, like presumption of guilt is beginning to take hold. Presumption of innocence is beginning to take hold. And then these are those who say that they were considered guilty only after the judge heard the evidence, which is the way it should be. And so that we see an increase also. It goes from 32% to 54%. So what this means is, I think, that we can actually ask inmates whether they are innocent, or about other forms of police procedures, or about whether they were arrested, how they were treated by police. We can ask them a number of things, because when we ask them the most sensitive questions, such as, are you innocent, we do get answers that are meaningful. If they weren't reliable, then if all inmates said we're innocent, we would see all these bars up to 100%. So this is meaningful information. It's valuable valuable data to evaluate reforms. This is two states. Mexico State over here. Mexico State, Estado de Mexico, is a horseshoe-shaped state that surrounds Mexico City. It's a very populated state, and this is Mexico City over here. And what we see is Mexico City has not implemented the adversary system. It's still in the process of doing this. And Mexico State is one of the states that has reformed. And it's the same question, are you innocent? And the number goes down from 66% before the reforms were implemented down to 48%. Mexico City, in contrast, is getting worse. They haven't done anything. This is where Toño Zúñiga, the protagonist of Presunto Culpable, was tried. And it's getting worse from 55% to 68% of inmates now say they're convicted in error. And then there's, what explains these changes? I don't know, but part of the problem was that it was a very bad infrastructure for trying people. For those who have seen the movie, you will remember that it was a noisy environment. The defendant stands behind bars. He is dressed as an inmate and presented in a guilt presumptive way to the judge and to the court staff. So, there's a glass, a window from where the inmate is presencing the trial. So this has changed. The infrastructure's changed. And now the inmates can actually hear what's going on in the trial, as we can see in the place that adopted the adversary system. And in Mexico City, there is virtually no change. The record of the trial didn't used to be objective. There was dictation going on, and the judge decided to edit out whatever was inconvenient. Now there's video and audio recording, and this is huge. This is Estado de Mexico after the reforms with video and audio recording, and Mexico City, which has not implemented any reforms, you see no change. And this is, I think, very compelling evidence that it's methodologically sound to ask inmates about all these questions, because here they are evaluating positively the judge who convicted them and the prosecutor who accused them. These are inmates who say that the judge was very clear in his verdict, and inmates that say that the prosecutor was very clear in the way they accused them. And I don't know why. Oh yeah, here we go. So again, in Mexico City, there's no change. And in Estado de Mexico, before the reforms, we see what the numbers looked like. So this is good news for us, because then we can really continue asking this kind of questions to inmates. Instead of having inmate surveys that assume guilt and that use this data, for finding out how crimes are committed, we can use this to evaluate whether the justice system is working. And then more changes. How well equipped was the court to receive the defendant? This is the percent of inmates who said that there was a chair. Toño Zúñiga, the protagonist of Presunto Culpable, used to be standing like for 6 hours every hearing. There was no toilet, so people had to relieve themselves on site, and the place smelled terrible. It just didn't contribute to having a good place to have your freedom decided upon. So now courts have a chair for the defendant, and they have a water closet. Not everybody gets that anyway. So how is the court equipped to receive the public? And now we get courts in Estado de Mexico that have air conditioning and microphones and speakers and seats for the public. So it's a way better environment to have justice served. And then, of course, we couldn't have a justice system without a judge. We used to have hearings without judges present. And now, this is Estado de Mexico without a judge. And now 87% of defendants say there's a judge present in their trial. So all this is positive change. This is how the new courts look like in Estado de Mexico. You can see there's microphones right there, and there's a seat for the witness and the place for the judge and seats for the public to see. This is another view of the same courtroom. And this is how the courts looked like, or the way they look like in Mexico City, which hasn't implemented the reforms. This is the glass I'm talking about that doesn't let them hear, and he has to be standing there leaning like that. And this is Toño's view of the courtroom the day he was being tried. The witness there, the defender right there, the judge right here, and everybody's turning their backs at him. And the public is way in the back over there. And this is one of our cameras there filming his trial. So this is the main infrastructural change that is going on in Mexico. But I think adopting a new justice system and transforming Mexico into a system that has an adversary trial, it's not about having air conditioning or microphones or, of course we need judges present in the courtroom, but we also need a greater balance of power between prosecutors and defenders. And I think this is the place where the Pena Nieto reforms, by the way, these reforms were implemented when Enrique Pena Nieto was the governor in Mexico State. Now he's the president of Mexico. So these reforms have their shortcomings, and this is where we begin to see them. So if we were to have a more balanced justice system, we would expect to have prosecutors and defenders to have a sort of more equivalent power. So I started to get at this by asking who was speaking more during the trial. And again, so Estado de Mexico, and this is Mexico City and Mexico City. So this is our comparison group, and this is the reformed state. And if you just look at the red bar, prosecutor, before the reforms, this was 29%, and this number goes up to 70%. It's a huge change. So you see prosecutors are beginning to talk more in the courtroom. What does that mean? I'm not sure, but it does mean that, it probably means that they're exercising more power or have more control of the hearings. And with defenders, this is not the case. They are more silent even after the reforms. And these are all, by the way, statistically significant changes. So the number of inmates that report that the defender was talking a lot drops from 49% to 42%. And then in Mexico City, for some reason, it's not stable as a comparison group. The defenders start speaking more, from 34% to 45%. But I grant this is not like the best way to measure who's in control of the trial hearings. So I went and asked this question in a more direct way in 6 states. Who was in charge of the hearing is what I ask now. And what you can see is that, again, there's this rise in prosecutorial power from 32% to 49%. And then there's this decline in the power of defenders. It goes down from 11% to 5% in the new justice system. So what I'm thinking that this data means is that this is not really an adversary system that we're having in Mexico. An adversary system would show defenders that are more combative or that at least are as powerful as prosecutors. And this huge gap just tells us that, those who have gained in this policy-making bet are prosecutors. And there's more evidence of this. So for example, I started looking at eyewitness evidence. Eyewitness evidence is very commonly used in Mexico, and I think it's very commonly used worldwide. It's very persuasive evidence. It's also very tricky. It's very easy for judges to decide to convict based on this kind of evidence. And it's very difficult for courts to know when to lend credence to this sort of evidence. So I'm asking here, was your defender able to confront eyewitness evidence? And this is the percent who say yes. So Estado de Mexico in 2008, the number goes down from, okay, oh no, these are all the labels are wrong. I don't know what happened here. Correct. But so what's going on, and I can't tell anymore because I'm missing my labels. But I think what's going on, and this is this tag, is was your defender present during the procedure? And the percentage who say yes is very low. And I think this is this one. And I don't know what's going on with this. So I think I'm going to skip that. But what I think, and you're going to have to trust me because the data doesn't show it, or the labels are not there. But what's going on is during the critical time when a defendant is being identified at a prosecutor's office, there's not even a defender present to make sure that things are done well. And then when the defender is present, the defendants report that the attorney was unable to do anything to confront the eyewitness. Yeah, I'm sorry that's playing wrong with the labels. So one of the things we did is eyewitness identification procedures are really tough to talk about to inmates. So what we did is we created these drawings. And instead of having these wordy descriptions that could be confusing, we made this so that we could show them, what is it that we were asking about. And here we showed them 3 scenarios, and we were asking, were you shown alone to the eyewitness? Were you shown in a group to the eyewitness? Or were you shown in a sequential lineup to the eyewitness? And what you can see here, so those are the 3 scenarios. The very absolute worst, I think, is this one, when you're shown alone, because anybody can point to someone who's being shown at them, and it doesn't mean anything in terms of proving that the eyewitness can identify a person. And this is the best way to do it according to the most recent research, which is having a sequential lineup. So the suspect and the distractors are presented in a sequential way. And then we know if the eyewitness can actually identify someone. And this is error-prone. People tend to pick a person who most resembles the suspect, but not necessarily the guilty person. So these are the results. Were you shown alone to the eyewitness? This is Mexico State, and Mexico State, and Mexico City, and Mexico City. And so what we see is that almost everybody is getting shown to the eyewitness alone, regardless of whether it's a reformed state or a non-reformed state. So 64% in Mexico State report being shown alone to the eyewitness. So the absolute worst way of being identified is what's happening in most jurisdictions in spite of reforms. But then what's more worrying is it would be okay if this was happening and defenders took note of it. So this green bars, the question is, did your attorney ask you this basic question? Did your attorney ask you whether you were shown alone or in a group to the eyewitness? And most of inmates don't get this question asked. So 14% before the reforms. That, I grant you that it went slightly up, 26% after the reforms took place in Estado de Mexico, and 22% in Mexico City. But what I'm trying to say is that there's no causal mechanism for this new adversary system in Mexico to change the way police investigates crime if defenders are not doing their job, if they're not aggressive enough. And I think this is what the data is showing. I don't know how it's going to look 5 years from now or 3 years from now. Maybe this number will go up. But I think we're relying too much on this policymaking bet of having very transparent trials with a better infrastructure. This is, another look at the same problem. I started looking at interrogation evidence and confession evidence, which is also very persuasive. When a person confesses, it really almost always leads to a conviction in Mexico. And so what this shows is, and I think you can see it here, this shows first a decline in the use of detectives to interrogate suspects, which should be of concern. So before the reforms took place, and this is with all the states that have implemented this reform, which are 6 states by now, before the reforms took place, this number, 62% of inmates were being interviewed by detectives. And the number goes down to 46%, which means not that people are being less interrogated, it means that other officials are doing the interrogations. And you can see here, this rise here, preventive policemen are starting to do more interrogations. And then here, there's no tag, but these are military officials. So more soldiers are interrogating suspects. So the new justice system is kind of shifting to whom it delegates the task of interrogating suspects. And it's not people, or it's not officials who are trained to conduct interrogations. So more military and more preventive policemen, which in Mexico are this policemen that you find on the streets who are not trained to conduct the interrogations. And this, I know you are not going to be able to see the numbers, but I started asking inmates how were they treated by authorities who interrogated them. And this is a scale of the mistreatments that they endured. What you see here at the left are the least egregious forms of mistreatment, and then at the right are the most egregious forms of mistreatment. So here at the right are the inmates who received electric shocks, or had their head immersed in water, or their head covered with a bag, or not allowed to breathe. And here in the left we have those who were insulted, or those who were cuffed to a chair, or those who were stripped naked or beaten. And so what you see is that The most egregious forms of mistreatment are really infrequent. This is 7% or 4% or 14%. And the least egregious mistreatments are more frequent, being insulted 73%, for example. But the message of this chart is, if you look, this cluster of bars is each one of them is Estado de Mexico before reforms, and Estado de Mexico after reforms is the red one, and then Mexico City or comparison group in the equivalent periods. So if the justice system was working to reduce the amount of mistreatment, that inmates endure, this red bar would be systematically lower for every group of forms of mistreatment. So this would be low, here it would come down, it would come down, it would come down. What we're seeing, that's not the case. If you see, they all look pretty much about the same. I mean, there's some places where they are higher, some places where they're lower. So being beaten in the feet, for example, increased in Estado de Mexico after the reforms. So there's no systematic change going on here that would tell us that torture is going to decline in Mexico or that the mistreatment is going to decline for people who undergo interrogation. And again, I don't know why this is going on, but certainly the trial is not a corrective measure for this. Having wooden benches and having more transparent courtrooms is not going to fix this for Mexico. And I think it's logical in a way. It's kind of like we've had a very broken justice system, and it's like a bus. It's an old bus, and we have myopic, nearsighted drivers. And instead of investing in giving these bus drivers corrective lenses, and instead of investing in new tires for the buses, we are giving our judges, or the drivers of the buses, this tailored suits. So that's the type of misinvestment that we're seeing in Mexico. I'm going to skip all my slides just to show you one example of this. This is, to the left here, Mexico's new legislation. And this to the right is the UK's Police and Criminal Evidence Act. And what I'm doing here is just counting the words that each piece of legislation dedicates to regulate interrogations. So in the UK, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act dedicates 4,700 words to regulate this encounter between citizens and police. And Mexico, this is the legislation that is going to be implemented within 15 months. It's 69 words telling police how they should treat a suspect. Another view of the same problem. This is all of Mexico's legislation for each state. This legislation is going to be supplanted by the new national code, which is right here. 287 words to regulate eyewitness evidence. And this is the Police and Criminal Evidence Act in the UK. 4,700 words to regulate eyewitness identification procedures. So, of course, there's this gap or a lack of guidance given to police and to investigative authorities on how to treat suspects and how to investigate crime. And I think this is what's going on. So there's this deficit of legislation and a lack of investment in the lower echelons of the justice system. I have more data to show, but I think this is enough for now. I think this suggests that Mexico needs to refocus the reform efforts and to strengthen the defense and to make sure that the coverage of the defense services comes down to the police stations and to the places where suspects are held at the very earliest stages of their intervention in the justice system. And so this is what's going on right now in Mexico. And I think it also suggests the good news is that we can interview users of the justice system and find out new things about how they're being treated by authorities. In Mexico, we usually are doing or are using data that is official data, reported crime rates. One last example here. This is Pena Nieto after The Economist caught him lying about the rates of homicide in his state. And this, it's very manipulable data, the official statistics on crime. They're manipulable, but they're also not very useful. They don't tell us much about how the authorities are investigating crime and how they treat the users of the justice system, how victims are treated or how suspects are treated. And I think inmate surveys can really help overcome that gap in knowledge that we have. So I'll leave it at that for now, and I'll wait for your questions. So thank you. Yes.
So he was caught like manipulating this data?
Yes.
Or?
When he was the governor of the Estado de Mexico, he claimed that Pena Nieto claimed that in his state, the murder rate had gone down by 50%, while in the rest of the country, which was immersed in the drug war, the homicide rate was climbing. So this official statistics, which is what we have available usually to evaluate the justice system, are not enough. I think we should be using data from users of the justice system more frequently. Yeah. Yes?
Is this data being used, are these data being used by?
What I've been doing is I've been trying to, well, I've been meeting with empresarios, with the community of business leaders in Mexico, and I've been showing this data to them, and to my surprise, they're interested. So I've been going, I visited now, I think 8 states where I meet with business leaders in the community, and I show them this, and I kind of bang them on the head for just focusing on the rates of kidnappings or all the car thefts. And I say, this is useful to know, but we need to have this other sort of information in the way we evaluate the justice system. And there may be partnerships with them to go around nationally and ask this in the southern states and all the places where the reform is going to be implemented. Yeah, Steve.
I'm wondering how many subjects you spoke to for your research.
So this is a sample of about 250 inmates per state, and but for some states I did much more than that, about 750 inmates in Mexico City and Estado de Mexico. So it's about now about 2,000 inmates. So I think it's a big enough sample for this, and I'm mostly showing statistically significant results. So I think we had a large enough sample to do this. One other thing we did is, given my experience with the justice system, and I knew that most inmates are poor or they just stole a subway ticket, what we did is we biased the sample a little bit towards people who had convictions of greater than 10 years. So there would be serious crimes, so that then the authorities I could reasonably expect the authorities to have invested themselves in investigating these crimes, or in having an interrogation, or in having a line-up procedure. So this is reliable information because of what we did with the sample. Yeah. Yes, Chuck.
Yeah. So I was just wondering. So some of the data about who is speaking more, or who has more of a role in the trial is really interesting. And I was wondering if there was a story to tell from the data that you had here that showed kind of a successful transition or movement toward a successful transition to an adversary system. Because I would expect that under the old system, where trials were done by the compilation of a dossier, right, the written record that a prosecutor would compile outside of court, and that a judge would read, that one would expect to see in court the defense counsel having a more active role, because it's the prosecutor presenting the evidence through preparation prior to the trial and in a written record, and a judge reviewing it there, and then encountering the written record, it may be the role of the defense lawyer to speak more actively in that system. But in an adversarial system, if there's a presumption of innocence and not a presumption of guilt, and if the prosecutor has to present sufficient evidence through oral testimony in an open proceeding, the prosecutor is going to have to work much more during the course of that proceeding to be presenting the evidence. So in a U.S. court, it would be so common to see a prosecutor taking up most of the time in a trial simply by presenting evidence through witnesses to overcome the presumption of innocence. And I was wondering whether then what you've shown is actually a move toward that. If you have a prosecutor as having a more dominant role just in terms of the percentage of the proceeding the prosecutor is speaking in, that might just be very consistent with a successful move to a system where the evidence has to be presented openly and orally.
That could be the case. You may be right, but also one of the things you may it may be that I don't know. This is just I'm asking them who was speaking more, who was in control of the hearing, and those numbers show prosecutors are increasing their activity in the courtroom. But I also asked them very objective stuff. So, for example, I asked them, were you shown alone to the eyewitness in the lineup identification procedure? And they respond yes. And then I ask, well, did your attorney ask you this question, which is kind of basic? And the answer is no, they never did that. And then, so for example, for all these sorts of mistreatment that they endure, like being stripped naked or receiving electroshocks, I asked them at the end of that scale, which is a 34-item scale of mistreatment, I asked them, did your attorney ask you any of these questions? And the answer typically is no. About 80% of inmates say, my defender never asked these sorts of questions to me, which tells me that, that's unquestionably bad practice. The defenders are not doing anything to prepare themselves to protect their client or to represent them in court. And these are the most common forms of evidence they're encountering. It's not going to be DNA or the fingerprint that decides most cases in Mexico when we know police are poorly paid. So it's going to be eyewitness testimony and the confession. And if defenders are not asking basic questions about how they were being treated, then I think it's safe to conclude that there's not enough investment in defenders at all. And then you see the legislation as well. How is a defender going to confront a police officer in a courtroom if the legislation says nothing? So, if there were legislation saying or obliging police to videotape interrogations, for example, which is a very good measure to protect them from mistreatment. If the legislation required officers to do this, then defenders could have a simpler role in the courtroom. But the legislation says nothing. And with the identification procedures, again, the legislation says very little. So I think this leaves inmates and citizens very much unprotected when they have an encounter with police. And it's very difficult for defenders to overcome this in a courtroom. They could, of course, cite international practice and say, in San Francisco, they would videotape an interrogation, and you didn't. But courts, I don't think, in Mexico are going to buy that kind of argument. So I don't know, but I do think it means a weakness in the implementation of the adversary system. It means, I think this represents a great belief in, I would say, deregulation, or not. Mexico comes from a very bureaucratic justice system. And I think reformers thought that one of the ways to have more agile courts and more creative prosecutors was to remove regulation. And this just shows how it is. And the UK is obviously an adversary system, but it doesn't deregulate crime investigations. It's just they're heavily regulated, and that provides a tool for defenders to contain police abuses. So I think this is what is lacking. We have too much money invested in the top, too much legislation invested in the courts, and very little at the base of the pyramid. So I think that needs to shift. It's a top-heavy system right now. Yeah. So, in the back, yes, Francisco.
I was wondering how much is of this new code that actually works. I mean, sometimes just the old one wasn't that wrong at all. Sometimes it's not implemented well. No? And you talked about how policemen that are not trained to interrogate people are doing so. And maybe that's illegal. Maybe that shouldn't be the case. Maybe that was taken before as well. And that just has not been properly implemented yet. Should that is, I don't know if you have any statistics if that's the case, or you know.
So statistics on-
what was legal, or where was the system corrupt before, and how this new code changed that or not changed that?
So can you please ask again, because
So maybe the old law
Yes?
also had good phrasing in, for example, in who is in charge of interrogation.
Okay.
But maybe it was not implemented before. So what makes us believe that it's only in the new code, that the new code or an alternate new code would be better than the old one?
So this is pretty much how much words were dedicated to regulating, for example, interrogations throughout Mexico before the reforms. This is just the new national code, but every state code dedicated just as much detail to the encounter of suspects and the police. Amnesty International recently did a survey, an open population survey to Mexicans, and they asked, if you were arrested by the police, do you fear that you would be tortured? And about 64% of the population responded, yes, I fear I would be tortured. So for the encounter that Mexicans fear the most with the police, like this is very, very little regulation. So I don't think it's a problem of implementation. I think it's a problem of lack of regulation, of lack of training. I meant to bring a picture of my daughter who's sitting in the back next to a police station. But police stations in Mexico virtually don't exist. They're literally the size of like those 4 squares. They have space for a toilet, and sometimes not even that. They don't have a phone or internet. So it's a really low quality infrastructure to give any service. So there's a problem of legislation, a problem of resources that are being spent on the tailored suits for the judges and marble floors for the court hearings, but there's nothing spent in the police right now. And there's a lot of this distrust in the police in Mexico, and so that I think creates a vicious circle, because legislators can't reasonably propose to empower police now to be able to investigate. Because when they propose this, everybody thinks, the policeman who sits in this booths of concrete in the street is going to be able to look at my phone records or interrogate me or investigate me. I don't want this. And so it seems scandalous every time a legislator tries to shift and increase powers in the police and send resources to the police because of this lack of trust. So something needs to change in the conversation about policymaking in Mexico. About 10 years ago, when we first spoke about having an adversary system and oral trials, we faced opposition from the judiciary, and the judiciary, said we don't want to copy models from the United States and from North America. We're fine as we are, and these are our traditions, and we have a written trial, and this is what we do. And then when we showed El Túnel was a documentary, a 20-minute short that was a precursor of Presunto Culpable. Things started to change. Carmen Aristegui, she showed that short video in a CNN program, and then thanks to her we met Toño Zúñiga, and thanks to Carmen then we ended up making Presunto Culpable. I think that really led to a significant change in the way politicians were thinking about the justice system. And when a constitutional amendment was presented to the Cámara de Diputados, to the legislators, there's 500 diputados, 494 voted in favor of having a new adversary system in Mexico because of the effort to persuade them. And I think we're now at the stage when something similar needs to happen with the police. We need to persuade politicians that we need to authorize the police to be able to investigate crimes. I don't think I was clear about this. Most policemen in Mexico are not authorized to receive crime complaints, to interrogate anybody, to investigate crimes in any way. And this is reflected in the way the legislation is crafted right now. It almost doesn't mention the police at all. And of course, without a police that is credible and functional, the justice system is not going to work. This is why the justice system looks like this. We're worse than Africa, and I'm just going to show you this again. worse than Africa, worse than most of Latin America. There. You know, for a country that is richer than 60% of the countries in this chart, which would mean that it has money to pay better salaries, better equipment, we're really underperforming everybody. We're worse than Senegal, worse than Uganda, worse than Nigeria, worse than Ethiopia, right there next to Venezuela, next to Bulgaria, and to Liberia. This is what the countries that are on top of Mexico have that we don't is that you can call the police in each of these countries. You can dial a number and actually call the police. If you call the police in Mexico, they will answer the phone and maybe they will come to the crime scene or to wherever you are, and they'll say, "I'm sorry, but we cannot even take your complaint. So we'll drive you to the Ministerio Público, where you will make a line of 3 or 4 hours, because all the prosecutors are the ones who are authorized to receive crime complaints, and you'll wait 3 hours to be able to complain of a lost wallet or of a stolen car or whatever happened to you." And all these countries are different in that respect. You can actually call the police, and they have some investigative authority. So again, when you propose this in Mexico to actually empower the police to investigate, everybody goes like, "Oh, you can't do this. This is really dangerous." So that's what needs to change. Yeah.
If I'm reading this correctly, the only countries that are demonstrably lower than Mexico are Venezuela and Liberia. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. Mexico is ranked, so the World Justice Project does a survey to about 99 countries, and Mexico is ranked in position 97, which is absolutely ridiculous for that economy and that culture. Yes. It's laughable. It really is. And it's laughable that the reform, the great reform that is, Enrique Pena Nieto's flagship reform for the justice system, forgot about the police. So he did this reform in his state where he put, cameras in the courtrooms, but there are no cameras in the holding cells where the inmates are interrogated. There's microphones in the courtroom, but the interrogations that the suspects endure are not audio taped. I mean, judges have their wooden hammer, but the police doesn't have bullets. They have to pay for their own bullets. They have to pay for the repairs of their police cars. They have to pay for their own uniforms. It's a very impoverished profession to be a policeman, and public defenders are not better off. So that explains this. No one wants to complain of a crime. And it also, it's one of the pluses of this sort of survey, because typically people think of interviewing crime victims to get this kind of data, to get evaluative data about the justice system. But when only 10% of crimes are complained about, then you need to interview 3,000 victims to have like 300 that actually went through the system. But with inmates, which is what we've seen, everybody went through the system, everybody got arrested, everybody was interrogated, everybody got convicted. And so with 30 inmates, you have very good evaluative data. So that's why 200 per state is in see these large effects of, judges present and ability to evaluate defenders or ability to evaluate police procedure. So I'm hopeful that this kind of tool is going to be used in Mexico more frequently. I'm now directing an effort to do this survey that I've done in this 8 states in the entire nation. So I'm going to do 32 jurisdictions over the next 3 years. And I hope this is going to be used by the business community to, tell their governments, you have to stop putting the head of suspects in the water so that they confess. And when they start caring about this, then I think we're going to have a more humane justice system. Yes.
As an expert in judicial system in Mexico, do you think the Supreme Court can play an important role in the implementation of the reform? Not implementation, I mean, I'm talking about, for example, the case of Florence Cassette. The resolution of the Supreme Court in that case was extremely important for due process, which is trying to correct, I imagine, the reform. But it was so questioned by the public opinion, and it was not
Not a very popular decision.
Yeah, not a very popular decision. So I'm wondering if you think that the Supreme Court can make a good, play a good role in this, in the whole police reform.
So, for those who don't know about this, the Florence Cassé case, this is a woman who's a French national who's accused of kidnapping, and she spends years in prison. Eventually, a Supreme Court justice proposed to release her, and then this caused a huge outrage, and she eventually was released by a Supreme Court decision. And so I've read the decision, and it's very shallow, I have to say, in what it asserts. It's important, but because of our judicial tradition, we're not going to have a case akin to Miranda versus Arizona in Mexico. You know, that case that shapes police interrogation or how it should be conducted in the United States. No longer, I know. Chuck is just like, it's been destroyed by subsequent decisions. But the Supreme Court had the power in the US to set standards and to decide how every police officer was going to behave in front of a citizen when they were about to interrogate him. And it set a system that was followed everywhere in the US, right? The decision in the Florence Cassé case would never be that. It's not going to change public policy about interrogations or about how foreigners are treated in Mexico or about anything, because we have a system that with a very low presidential power, it's a civil justice system. So if anything, it has a symbolic value, but there would need to be some change in the Supreme Court and in the law so that it would be a stronger court, and we don't have that yet. So I think for Mexico, the solution is going to have to come from legislators. It's really down to that. I think courts will follow what the law says, if the law said anything. And the problem is right now the law doesn't say anything about the encounter that Mexicans fear the most, about how the police is supposed to investigate anything. They've really been silent. And what I'm asking from legislators in Mexico is just, I want a law that tells police how to behave when they receive a call, when they receive a crime complaint, when they are to interrogate someone, when they are going to do an identification procedure, when they're going to search a car, when they're going to knock on your door or come into your house and do a search in your house. Those 5 things. If the law said 5 things, those 5 things, I think we would have a change in this kind of graph. Because then, the police would be authorized to investigate crime, it would be told how to do it, and then defenders would be able to police the police on how it behaved. And this is what we have right now. We have a really silent legislature on this stuff. Yeah.
Is this data available for everyone?
So not yet. Well, this one is. This is, if you just Google the World Justice Project, the Rule of Law Index, you can see how Mexico is performing on various dimensions of the rule of law. But the rest of it is my dissertation data, and I have yet to submit it. But it will be available very soon. I think as of this summer, it will be up for grabs. Yeah. So if you want to use it, I'll let you know. All right. Well, so if there's no more questions, I really thank you.